In this video, we're going to learn about comparative advantage and understand the gains from trade. And let's start with a little understanding. Economist Paul Samuelson was asked, what have economists contributed that was not trivial and not necessarily obvious? And his argument was comparative advantage was. It was something that was not trivial, it was not obvious, and yet most people do not understand it. So we're going to go over comparative advantage to get a better understanding of what it is. Usually we think of trade as being advantageous only if we're the best at doing something and we trade with people who can't do something as well as we can. And that's the flaw in the argument. That's not the case. We don't trade with people because they're better at doing something than we are. We trade with people because they have a lower opportunity cost, and then we have lower opportunity costs of doing something relative to anyone else. So let's use a simple example here. Let's take LeBron James. Let's say LeBron James can mow his lawn in 1 hour, and a kid down the street, Freddie, can also mow LeBron's yard, but it would take Freddie 2 hours to mow his lawn. Let's also assume that LeBron has a clause in his contract that for every hour he practices basketball, he gets another $1,000. It can be the performance clause because he scores more points, whatever it is. His time spent mowing the lawn means he gives up shooting an hour of basketball, and that hour of basketball leads to a $1,000 increase in his salary. Freddie would give up $20 for the 2 hours it would take him to mow the lawn. He has a job that pays $10 an hour, and he would have to give up working at that job for 2 hours, earning $20 over those 2 hours in order to mow LeBron's yard. So the question is, should LeBron mow his own lawn? He's more proficient at it. He's twice as good at mowing the lawn as Freddie is, or should he hire Freddie to do so? And it's pretty easy to understand the argument that LeBron has an absolute advantage over Freddie, but Freddie has a comparative advantage over LeBron in mowing the lawn because he only gives up $20 to mow the lawn, whereas LeBron gives up $1,000 to do so. So somewhere between $20 and $1,000, LeBron and Freddie have a mutually advantageous trade where Freddie will mow LeBron's lawn. Both of them are going to be better off. Matter of fact, let's say it's a $50 agreement. Freddie's better off by $30. LeBron is better off by $970. Let's take a look at another example. Let's say Remy and Colette own restaurants. They have their own separate restaurants. They specialize in barbecuing pork shoulder butts, and they also serve cheesecake for dessert. Their food is identical in every way, so there's no specialty that one has over the other. They both serve the exact same food. They prepare it the exact same way. It's just we'll see that Remy has an absolute advantage over Colette in everything. Suppose that in 8 hours, Remy can smoke 10 pork butts, or he can bake 5 cheesecakes, whereas Colette can smoke 5 pork butts, or she can bake 4 cheesecakes in that same amount of time of 8 hours. We can see that Remy has the absolute advantage in both smoking pork and baking cheesecakes. But can they benefit when they trade with each other? And yes, they can. Let's start with understanding. Here's Remy is going to, his abilities are smoking 10 pork butts or baking 5 cheesecakes in 8 hours. Colette is 5 pork butts or 4 cheesecakes in 8 hours. And we can see that Remy is twice as productive at Colette at producing pork butts. He can do twice as many in the same amount of time that she can. And he also can do 1.25 times more cheesecakes in the same amount of time it takes Colette to do cheesecakes. So we can see that Remy has an absolute advantage in both pork butts and cheesecakes. However, Colette is going to have what we call comparative advantage in producing cheesecakes. Remy is best at producing pork butts, so he's going to specialize in pork butts. Colette is least worst at producing cheesecakes, so she will produce cheesecakes, and we'll see why now. Let's look at the cost to produce both of them. So for Remy to smoke pork, he would have to give up 5 cheesecakes for the 10 pork butts he would smoke. So he gives up half a cake per shoulder pork butt that he smokes. The inverse of that is if he were to produce cheesecakes, he would give up 10 cheesecakes or 10 smoke butts for the 5 cheesecakes that he's going to produce. So he would give up 2 pork butts per cheesecake that he produces. So Remy's cost of producing smoked pork is half a cheesecake per shoulder butt. His opportunity cost of producing cheesecake is 2 smoked shoulder butts per cheesecake that he makes. For Colette, she is going to give up 4 cheesecakes in order to smoke 5 shoulder butts. So her opportunity cost of producing pork is 0.8 cheesecakes per shoulder butt. On the inverse of that, she would give up 5 shoulder butts to produce 4 cheesecakes, so her cost of producing cheesecakes would be 1.25 shoulder butts. So again, as we can see before, Remy is most best at producing smoked pork butts, which means he incurs a lower opportunity cost to smoke pork relative to Colette, who Remy gives up 0.5 cheesecakes, Colette gives up 0.8 cheesecakes. Colette has a comparative advantage in baking cheesecakes because she only gives up 1.25 smoked shoulder pork butts, whereas Remy has to give up 2. So Colette is least worst at producing cheesecakes, and that shows by her comparative advantage. Now, how do they benefit from this? Let's start with both Remy and Colette. Pork butts are on the x-axis, cheesecake is on the y-axis. As we said, Remy can produce either 10 pork butts or 5 cheesecakes in an 8-hour period, and Colette can do either 4 cheesecakes or 5 smoked pork butts in an 8-hour period. If they were to operate in autarky by themselves, they have to operate Remy along this yellow line, Colette along this green line. So for Remy to make a cheesecake, he would have to move along that yellow line beginning at 10 on the x-axis, and he would give up 2 shoulder butts to get 1 cheesecake. So he would end up with 8 shoulder butts, 4 cheesecakes. Or he could do 6 shoulder butts and 8 shoulder butts and 1 cheesecake. Or he could do 6 shoulder butts and 2 cheesecakes. Or 4 shoulder butts and 3 cheesecakes. He would move along that yellow line. For Colette, she would be giving up 1.25 shoulder butts per cheesecake. So if they operate without trade with each other, each has to operate on their respective line. Remy on the yellow line, Colette on the green line. If they trade, however, Remy would specialize in pork butts, and he would smoke 10 pork butts in an 8-hour period, not producing any cheesecakes. He knows that Colette's cost of producing shoulder butts is 0.8 shoulder butts per cheesecake. That was her cost, was 0.8 shoulder butts per cheesecake. And therefore, she would be willing to give up, for those 10 shoulder butts, she would be willing to give up at most 8 cheesecakes. She wouldn't give up more. She would, if Remy said to her, give me 1 cheesecake per shoulder butt, she wouldn't do it because her cost of producing smoked pork is 0.8. So the most she would give up would be 0.8 cakes per shoulder butt. And if Remy produces 10 shoulder butts, he could trade them at most with Colette. He would get 8 cheesecakes back from her. If they traded along that green line, then all the gains from trade are going to Remy and none are going to Colette. On the other side, Colette's going to specialize in producing cheesecake, and she's going to look and say that it costs Remy 2 shoulder butts for every cheesecake. So if she tried getting more than 2 shoulder butts per cheesecake, he won't go for it. But somewhere up to 2 shoulder butts per cheesecake, Remy would accept a deal. So if she produces 4 cheesecakes, she would be willing to trade them to Remy at $2 pork shoulder butts each. So the most she could expect to get for her 4 cheesecakes would be 8 shoulder butts. So now somewhere between these 2 lines are mutually advantageous trades between the 2 parties. If they're operating on the yellow line, then Colette is getting all the gains from trade. If they're operating on the green lines, then Remy is getting all the gains from trade. Somewhere in between those 2 is a mutually advantageous trade. So we can look at this and see, let's assume that they pick 0.64 cheesecakes per shoulder butt or 1.5625 shoulder butts per cheesecake. So that's going to be the trade. It's in between the 0.5 and 0.8 cheesecakes per shoulder butt or the 1.25 and 2 shoulder butts per cheesecake. So that would be somewhere in between those, and let's just pick 0.64 cakes per shoulder butt. Before trade, let's say Colette baked 2 cakes and smoked 2.5 shoulder butts. That would be along that green line for her. But if she trades with Remy at 0.64 cakes per shoulder butt, then what she can do is bake 4 cakes, trade 2 to Remy, and get 3.125, excuse me, the trading at the 1.5625 butts per cake. She can trade 2 of those cakes to Remy and get 3.125 shoulder butts, which is more than the 2.5 she did have. Remy spends his time, before he would spend his time doing 6 shoulder butts and 2 cakes, but now with trade he can do the 10 shoulder butts and trade 2 to Remy, and will end up getting trade with Colette, he'll give 3.125 shoulder butts to Colette and get the 2 cakes, giving him 6.875 shoulder butts and 2 cakes, which is more than the 6 shoulder butts and 2 cakes he was having operating by himself. So both of them have done better off by trade with each other. Now, one last thing is we might want to monetize this. Suppose cheesecake sold for $40. What would be the price range within dollars or in dollars for the cheese to the pork shoulder butts, assuming that the cheesecake sold for $40? Well, we want to monetize that cost. So again, it costs 0.64 cakes is what their trade was, somewhere between 40 times 0.5 or $20 per shoulder butt, and 40 times 0.8, those are the costs of producing cheesecake for the two, then it would be $32 per shoulder butt. Since we said it was 0.64, then the price for the pork butts would be $25.60 per pork butt, given that it was $40 per cheesecake and it's 0.64 cakes per butt.